are they? 40 people now living their final days in the special unit at San Quentin. Some wiped out an entire family in a single night. Some left behind a lingering fear for an entire city. Why did they do it? What drove them to that irreversible limit? Join me as we walk through the list of 40 names that even the justice system treads carefully around. First, Isauro Aguirre. When Gabriel Fernandez was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, the nurses could not believe what they saw. The body of the 8-year-old boy was covered in layers of old and new wounds. For 8 months, Isauro Aguirre, Gabriel's mother's boyfriend, turned their apartment in Palmdale into a house of torment. No whips, only bats, irons, BB guns, and countless lies. Gabriel died in silence, and America fell silent with him. Aguirre was arrested shortly after. Social workers, classmates, and doctors all confirmed the scale of the abuse was beyond imagination. In 2018, the court in Los Angeles sentenced him to death for murder with aggravated torture. He is now held at Corcoran, amid a wave of outrage that has never subsided, where the name Gabriel has become a symbol of the cruel silence of adults. Second, Marcus Delon Wesson. On March 12, 2004, Fresno police received a frantic call from 2 young women. They said their father was holding the entire family hostage. When officers arrived at the small home, they never expected what was inside. 9 bodies stacked together. Each had been shot once. Marcus Wesson, a man who looked like a preacher, stepped out with blood still on his shirt. The investigation revealed something horrific. He was both the father and the grandfather of the victims. For years, Wesson manipulated his family like his own cult, forced incestuous marriages, preached about Jesus the vampire. Though he always denied pulling the trigger, the court still sentenced him to death. Today, Wesson lives in San Quentin, the final stop for a man who turned family into the deadliest weapon. Third, Alejandro Avila. Little Samantha Runyon, 5 years old, was playing in her yard when a stranger approached. He said he needed help finding his lost dog. Just hours later, Samantha's body was found, abandoned on a hillside. Her small body bore marks of cruelty too horrible to name. Alejandro Avila, previously investigated in another abuse case, was arrested after witnesses confirmed his car matched footage from nearby cameras. At trial, the prosecutor said, "He did not just kill a child, he robbed an entire community of its trust." In 2005, Avila was sentenced to death. He is now at San Quentin, where every night serves as a reminder. Some crimes can never be forgiven. Fourth, Richard Allen Davis. One October night in Petaluma, 12-year-old Polly Klaas was at home with friends when a man broke in, armed with a knife. He covered Polly's mouth, took her away, and vanished into the darkness. More than 2 months later, during an unrelated arrest, Richard Allen Davis confessed. He led police to where he had buried her, deep in the woods, just a few miles from where she was taken. The entire nation was shaken. Polly's image became a symbol. Her case led California to pass the 3 strikes law. In 1996, Davis was sentenced to death. On the day of his sentencing, he mocked the victim's parents. The courtroom erupted in anger. He remains at San Quentin, not just as an inmate, but as a grim reminder to America. Sometimes, evil comes from the most ordinary faces. Fifth, Charles Chaitat. A cabin deep in the Calaveras woods. Footage from a hidden camera. Women trapped in a basement, begging in desperation. Charles Ng, alongside Leonard Lake, recorded everything like an experiment. From 1983 to 1985, they lured couples, families, and lone women to their so-called survivalist paradise. Then turned them into prey. When Lake was arrested and took his own life, Ng fled to Canada. After years of extradition battles, he faced trial in California. It became the most expensive court case in state history at the time. In 1999, Ng was sentenced to death. His face cold as stone, his eyes devoid of feeling. In Lake's diary, one line was written, "We create the world the way we want it." Ng was the living embodiment of that belief, warped and void of humanity. 6th, Cary Stayner, Yosemite, where nature's beauty meets serenity. But in the summer of 1999, this place was haunted by a man hiding among the tourists. Cary Stayner, a maintenance worker at a motel, approached visitors with a friendly face, then turned into a predator. 3 women, including a 15-year-old girl, were killed. Their bodies left in the wilderness. Weeks later, he murdered another woman near Mariposa. When arrested, Stayner confessed everything without hesitation. He said, "I was tired of holding back." Ironically, his brother, Stephen Stayner, had once been a symbol of survival after a kidnapping. But Cary became the opposite, a symbol of cold-blooded evil. He was sentenced to death. And now, inside his cell at San Quentin, he still paints landscapes, in a place where nature is no longer peaceful. 7th, Luis Bracamontes. 2 officers were shot dead in broad daylight, one at a Walmart parking lot, the other hunted down on the Sacramento freeway. The man behind these deaths was Luis Bracamontes, an illegal immigrant with a federal criminal record, yet still in possession of a rifle. When arrested, he showed no remorse. In court, he even laughed and declared, "I wish I could have killed more." This case became a symbol in America's debate over immigration and gun control. In 2018, he was sentenced to death after a trial that shocked the nation. He is now held at San Quentin, awaiting execution. But for many, no legal sentence can compare to the sentence of public opinion, where every word he speaks feels like a fresh wound to those who wear the uniform. 8th, Vincent Edward Brothers. When police entered the home in Bakersfield, they could not believe their eyes. 5 bodies, his wife, 3 young children, and mother-in-law, lay scattered across the rooms. There was no sign of forced entry, and Vincent, a school principal, had just returned from a work trip in Ohio. But his journey was exposed through rental car data, showing he had traveled thousands of miles just to commit the crime and return as if nothing had happened. In 2007, he was sentenced to death. Not just for the crime itself, but for the way he planned it. Methodical, cold, and calculated. Brothers is now held at San Quentin, carrying the label, "The Man Who Took the Lives of His Own Flesh and Blood." 9th, Randy Stephen Kraft. A highway, a car, a man asleep, beside the body of his victim. California officers pulled over the car in 1983 and uncovered what they called a scorecard of death. 61 cryptic entries, matching unsolved killings spanning over a decade. Randy Kraft, who appeared mild-mannered, was charged with taking the lives of at least 16 young men, many of them soldiers, truck drivers, or drifters. The victims were often drugged, restrained, tortured, and then discarded along highways. Kraft was sentenced to death in 1989. To this day, he has remained silent about the other names on the list, numbers no one truly understands except him. 10th, Tequan Andre Cox. One August morning, 4 bodies were found inside a small home in Los Angeles. The mother, sister-in-law, and 2 young nephews of former NFL player Kermit Alexander. They were shot right in the living room. No warning. No chance to beg for their lives. Tequan Cox, 18, a member of the Rollin 60 Crips gang, was identified as the mastermind. He had attacked the wrong house in a mistaken act of revenge. Police found matching ballistic evidence and witness statements. In 1986, Cox was sentenced to death, becoming one of the youngest inmates ever on death row at the time. Today, he remains at San Quentin, behind thick walls where time seems frozen since the night the Alexander family lost everything. 11th, Wayne Adam Ford. In October 1998, Wayne Ford walked into a police station carrying a bag. Inside was a body part of an unidentified woman. "I need to confess," he said, and began recounting 4 killings. All women, all picked up during his long-haul drives. He did not hide it. He did not show mercy. He simply explained, coldly and in detail. Investigations confirmed that from 1997 to 1998, Ford took the lives of at least 4 women, all with his bare hands. their bodies abandoned across multiple states. In 2006, he was sentenced to death. He did not protest, he simply stayed silent. At San Quentin, Wayne Ford is still known as the killer who turned himself in, a nickname carrying both horror and an oddity in a world where killers usually run. 12th, Maria Del Rosio, Rosie Alfaro. That day, the home in Anaheim was quiet. Autumn Wallace, 9 years old, was home alone, a book still open to page 3. The door opened and Rosie Alfaro stepped inside. She was not a stranger. She had once been friends with Autumn's older sister, but that day Rosie did not come to visit. With a knife in hand, she acted swiftly, leaving behind no life at the scene. Rosie was just 18 when she committed the crime. She later claimed she only intended to steal, but her actions went far beyond that. She was arrested shortly after. In court, in 1992, Rosie became the first woman sentenced to death in Orange County. She is now held at the Central California Women's Facility, carrying the sentence she calls the price of a moment when evil took control. 13th, Chester Duane Turner. Los Angeles in the 1980s. A city glowing by day but turning into a nightmare for women living on the margins after dark. For 11 years, at least 14 women went missing. Their bodies were found weeks later, and no one knew who was responsible. Not until 2003, when DNA from an old assault case linked them all to one man. Chester Turner. A pizza delivery worker, he quietly moved around the city. He did not choose victims at random. He targeted those overlooked, those no one would search for. In court, he denied all charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2007, Turner was sentenced to death, and later he received 4 additional murder convictions. In police files, detectives called him the invisible shadow haunting the city. 14th, Marcus Dorwin Adams. One afternoon in September in South Los Angeles, neighbors heard multiple gunshots coming from a parked car. When police arrived, 3 men lay slumped in their seats, each shot dead. The shooter was Marcus Dorwin Adams, only 24 at the time. He did not run, he left no explanation. Nearly a month later, Adams was arrested while involved in another bank robbery, where another person lost their life. Witness statements helped link him to the previous triple homicide. In 2003, the Los Angeles court sentenced Adams to death for 3 counts of aggravated murder. Today, he remains on death row at San Quentin, where time crawls like the ticking of a clock counting down toward an execution without a set date. 15th, Joseph Naso. A murder list found in a journal. Women's names sharing matching initials like Roxine Rogesh and Carmen Colon. When police opened Joseph Naso's apartment in 2010, they found not just photos of victims but a detailed map of the mind from a man who once called himself a photographer. For nearly 20 years, Naso traveled across states with a camera and those names in his head. 4 women were restrained until they could no longer breathe. Left powerless, their bodies discarded along roadsides. He lived quietly, once working as a delivery driver. No one suspected a 77-year-old man of being a serial killer. In 2013, he was sentenced to death. When asked in court, Naso said, "I was just taking pictures." But no one forgets. His photos became the legacy of a nightmare. 16th, Cynthia Lynn Kaufman. They were called a killer couple, but Cynthia Kaufman always said, "I was his victim too." Alongside her boyfriend, James Marlowe, she roamed across California in 1986. 4 women were kidnapped, tortured, and left on the roadside. Each case carried the same mark. Death was not the goal. It was the display of control. Cynthia claimed she was under psychological manipulation, but the physical evidence, from DNA, fingerprints, and survivor testimonies, showed her active role. In 1990, the court sentenced her to death. She remains one of the few women in California to face its harshest punishment. Kaufman is now held at Chowchilla, where every locked door serves as a reminder that victims are not always the ones behind bars. 17th, James Gregory Marlowe. No sound, No footprints left behind. But every step James Marlowe took led to the bound body of another woman, discarded like refuse. Alongside Cynthia Kaufman, Marlowe moved from town to town. Each stop marked the disappearance of another life. Victims were often young women working alone. Easy to approach, easy to erase. In his journal he wrote, "Killing is how I get back at life." When arrested, he showed no panic. He only smiled. In 1990, both were sentenced to death. To many, Marlowe was not just a killer. He was the embodiment of a dark storm where love and violence merged. In his cold, silent cell, he remains unchanged, just as he was from the day it all began. 18th. Michael Anthony Cox. 3 young women vanished in the same summer. Police found their bodies weeks later, scattered through the forests near Placerville. No signs of forced entry, no cameras, no witnesses. Michael Cox, once acquainted with one of the victims, was arrested based on a shifting witness statement and fragmented clues from the past. The trial ended quickly. The death sentence was handed down in 1985. Yet, decades later, questions remain. Was the testimony coerced? Was the evidence manipulated? Cox has never confessed, and within the walls of death row, he writes letters, each one insisting, "I am not the monster they want me to be." 19th. Kevin Cooper. A family of 4, including 2 young children, was found dead inside their home in Chino Hills. Police discovered their bodies covered in injuries, as if a storm of violence had raged through the night. Only one boy survived, carrying a faint memory of a black man. Kevin Cooper, an escapee from prison just days earlier, quickly became the prime suspect. Blood on his shirt, shoe prints in the house. Everything pointed to him. Yet, over the years, dozens of lawyers, journalists, even judges have argued that the evidence may have been planted. Cooper has always maintained his innocence. His death sentence from 1985 remains uncarried out, not only because of state moratoriums, but because this case remains one of the most bitterly divided in California's legal history. 20th. Stephen David Catlin. The deaths happened quietly. First his wife, then his stepmother, and finally his biological mother. All died of sudden heart failure. Doctors called it natural. But suspicions grew when tissue samples were tested. The same poison, paraquat. Stephen David Catlin, a polite man with an unsuspecting appearance, had been silently poisoning the 3 women closest to him. His motive? Insurance money. When arrested, Catlin denied everything, but his fingerprints on a chemical bottle in his garage became undeniable proof. In 1990, Catlin was sentenced to death. He is now held at Corcoran, an aging man once sharp enough to turn trust into a deadly weapon. 21st. Herbert James Coddington. 2 elderly women went missing after a gathering in Lake Tahoe. 2 days later, their bodies were found inside the home of a man who claimed to be a photographer, a man known for luring young girls with promises of modeling opportunities. Herbert Coddington not only killed the 2 older women, but also held and assaulted 2 underage girls. Police uncovered a fake studio where he documented every moment in a dark room. He offered no denial, only silence. In 1989, he was sentenced to death. In 2000, California's Supreme Court upheld the verdict, a reminder that those who twist art into manipulation will not be spared. Coddington remains at San Quentin, surrounded by real darkness. 22nd. Run Peter Chun. Amid gang violence in California during the 1990s, one name struck fear even among hardened criminals: Run Chun. Unlike typical shootings, he orchestrated a series of 9 killings, including children and relatives of his enemies. In the quiet of night, gunfire echoed like warnings from a world where life held no value. It took police nearly a year to track Chun down, from matching weapons to testimonies from his own crew. At his 2002 trial, he showed no remorse, simply stating, "I did what needed to be done." With 9 lives taken, the death sentence was inevitable. Today, he remains at San Quentin, where each passing day serves as its own sentence, repeating without end. 23rd. Keith Edward Adcox. One morning in May 1982, campers in Tuolumne County found a man lifeless in the pine forest near a missing truck. The victim was David Orozco, shot in the chest at close range with a handgun. The killer, Keith Adcox, then just 20 years old, was accused of plotting to steal the truck and money, ending it all with a cold trigger pull. Police tracked Adcox through a survivor's testimony, someone who narrowly escaped that deadly forest. In 1983, Adcox was sentenced to death for special circumstances murder. Decades later, he remains on death row at San Quentin. 24th. Jason Alejandro Aguirre. When gunshots rang out in a Garden Grove neighborhood, people thought it was just fireworks. But a 13-year-old boy never got back up. Jason Aguirre, a gang member, believed the child belonged to a rival group and chose to punish him in the coldest way possible. A bullet to the chest. No warning. No second chance. The case shook the community, as the victim had no ties to any gang. The FBI and witnesses identified Aguirre within days. In 2009, Orange County sentenced him to death for the murder of a minor. Since then, Aguirre has remained at San Quentin. The prison walls are not high, but the memory of that single gunshot is something he cannot escape. 25th. Joseph Aguayo. On a spring night in 1979, the body of Eva Chu, a woman 7 months pregnant, was found in her own Sacramento apartment. No signs of forced entry. No bloodstains. Only a deadly silence. Nearly 2 decades later, DNA technology revealed the killer. Joseph Aguayo, once an acquaintance of the victim. When arrested, he was already serving time for other crimes. The old murder seemed buried until evidence tied him to Eva's death. In 1996, Aguayo was sentenced to death. Now in his 80s, he remains at San Quentin among men who have killed, and men still waiting to meet death in their own way. 26th. David Carpenter. Along the peaceful trails surrounding the San Francisco Bay, few knew that in the 1980s these paths were once the hunting ground of a serial killer. David Carpenter, known as the Trailside Killer, quietly approached women walking alone. He did not rob. He did not scream. He simply acted. Fast, decisive, leaving no chance of survival. At least 7 victims lost their lives to him. After his final killing, police found a gun, knives, and a detailed map of the trails inside Carpenter's car. In 1984 and 1988, he received 2 death sentences. Now in his 90s, David Carpenter is California's oldest death row inmate, though the cruelty he unleashed has never aged. 27th. Albert Greenwood Brown. One October afternoon in Riverside, California, a 15-year-old girl vanished on her way home from school. The search lasted only a few hours before ending in tragedy. Her body was found in a nearby forest, showing clear signs of assault and premeditated murder. Albert Greenwood Brown, previously convicted of sexual assault, was arrested soon after making an anonymous call to the victim's family. In court, he confessed, leaving the courtroom silent in outrage. Brown was sentenced to death in 1982, but decades of appeals have delayed his execution. He remains at San Quentin, a man who once called to report his own crime as if reading lines from a sick play. 28th. Joseph Martin Danks. While living homeless in Los Angeles, Joseph Danks called himself the Punisher of the Shadows. Over several weeks in 1987, he killed 6 homeless men, each attacked as they slept. When arrested, he laughed and said they belonged nowhere. But it did not end there. In 1990, already in prison, Danks killed his cellmate, a 67-year-old man awaiting release. This time, he offered no denial, only stating, "I like the final silence." A later trial sentenced him to death. Danks remains at San Quentin. 29th. Carrie Lynn Dalton. No body, no clear crime scene. Yet testimony from a so-called punishment inside a trailer home in Live Oak Springs led to Carrie Lynn Dalton's death sentence. She was accused, alongside accomplices, of killing Irene Louise with knives, frying pans, and even acid, over allegations of stolen heroin. Though a body was never found, disturbing witness statements left the jury without hesitation. In 1995, Dalton was sentenced to death. Nearly 30 years later, California's Supreme Court reviewed the case for lack of physical evidence, yet she remains on death row. In her cell, she still claims to be a victim of rumor and collective panic. 30th. Ramon Bojorquez Salcido. One April morning in 1989, in the wine country of Sonoma, California, a small house revealed a scene of horror. Women, children, blood staining the floors. Ramon Salcido, a winery worker, had unleashed a spree of violence. His mother-in-law, 2 nieces, his wife, and their 3 children. He used a knife, each cut bringing a deadly silence. Miraculously, his 3-year-old daughter survived, carrying scars on her neck for life. Salcido fled to Mexico, caught while drunk, still rambling about hatred. In 1990, he received the death penalty. At San Quentin, he waits behind silent walls, where the crimes of that day have never faded from Sonoma's memory. 31st. Kevin Bernard Haley. He called himself the Remorseless Predator. In the summer of 1984, Kevin Haley roamed Los Angeles, choosing elderly women who lived alone as his victims. Dolores Clement, 55, was assaulted and suffocated in her small apartment. Laverne Stolze, 56, was beaten to death with a wooden stick in her bedroom. Police traced Haley through fingerprints and DNA, arresting him soon after he casually bragged about crimes yet undiscovered. 2 death sentences, 1 delayed, 1 reinstated. But the outcome remained the same. Kevin Haley remains at San Quentin, a man who fears nothing, believing that a few more victims would never have changed his fate. 32nd. David Esco Welch. On a dark night in Oakland, 1986, David Moochie Welch entered his ex-girlfriend's home with a gun in hand. No one had time to react. 6 people died, from children to adults. 2 survivors carry their scars for life. The motive? A nameless rage. An evening searching for a lost dog turned massacre. Welch fled for less than 10 hours, caught with a self-inflicted gunshot wound from his escape. In 1989, he was sentenced to death. His crime remembered as Oakland's worst mass killing until the Oikos University tragedy decades later. At San Quentin, Welch remained silent. No explanation, no regret. 33rd. Mauricio Rodriguez Silva. They called him the Monster. In 1984, within just 9 days, Mauricio Rodriguez Silva killed 3 people with both gun and knife. A 16-year-old boy in the Mojave Desert, a 16-year-old girl near an airport, and finally his own sister after his family had just taken him in. When police arrived at the final scene, he was calmly wiping away blood. No arguing, no panic. DNA confirmed everything. In 1986, he was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, debates arose over whether a Latino jury had the right to decide his fate, but the sentence remained. At San Quentin, Silva stands as a quiet shadow of darkness, a man who killed for control, for thrill, because humanity never existed within him. 34th. Jeffrey Aguilar. Oxnard, August 2008, an ordinary morning. But outside a bank, a gunshot ended the life of Gurmahinder Singh, a 55-year-old man who had just withdrawn $100,000 for his store. Jeffrey Aguilar was waiting, pulled the trigger without hesitation, took the money, and fled. Days later, he fired at police during another robbery, then hid in a motel in Carpinteria. When arrested, he mocked them, claiming he felt no regret. In 2013, he was sentenced to death. Those in the courtroom never forgot his scornful glance, a look that showed how, for some people, a life is worth less than a handful of dirty bills. 35th. Regis Dion Thomas. On a January night in 1993, 2 patrol officers in Compton never made it home. As they approached a suspicious vehicle, Regis Thomas stepped out, drew his gun, and pulled the trigger without hesitation. 2 shots. 2 officers dead on the spot. Thomas was a member of the Bloods gang, already carrying a murder conviction from 1992. When arrested, he said nothing, only stared blankly into the camera. In court, his defense pointed to a troubled childhood, but the jury refused to accept it. 2 death sentences were handed down. This case sparked public outrage for its sheer brutality, committed without cause. He was sent straight to San Quentin, confined to the isolated unit reserved for those with no path back. Regis Dion, Thomas, remains alive, but every door before him has been closed forever. 37th, Andre Alexander. Julie Cross, the first female agent for the Secret Service's Anti-Counterfeiting Division, was killed during a surveillance operation in 1980. The man who pulled the trigger was Andre Alexander, already convicted for murder within a counterfeit ring. He evaded capture for nearly 12 years until LAPD arrested him in 1992. The investigation revealed more. Alexander had killed 2 others to silence them. A series of crimes ended with a death sentence in 1996. In court, he only shook his head and said, "She was in the wrong job, at the wrong place, at the wrong time." At San Quentin, Alexander remains a reminder that not everyone in a black suit ends with glory. 38th, Alberto Alvarez. A police officer fell in broad daylight from a single gunshot in what began as a petty argument. Alberto Alvarez, a former convict with a history of violence, pulled the trigger and killed Officer Richard Rick May in San Mateo in 2006. When arrested, he simply said, "I didn't want to go back to prison." But that excuse couldn't save a life. In 2010, the court sentenced him to death. 1 bullet, 1 life, 1 death sentence no one pitied. As he left the courtroom, Alvarez bowed his head, not from remorse, but because there was nothing left to say. He now remains at San Quentin, a place he chose the moment he pulled the trigger. 39th. Roman Gabriel Aldana. A 16-year-old girl who had run away after a family argument could never have imagined her life would end inside an abandoned apartment in Riverside. Lured to what was promised as a party, she endured relentless physical and psychological abuse until survival was no longer possible. In the end, her body was left in a bathtub. The house was set on fire, as if to erase every trace. The ringleader, Roman Aldana, just 18 years old, the one who directed every gruesome act. The jury did not take long to deliver a death sentence. He remains on death row at San Quentin, where each passing day only deepens one question: how could someone so young harbor such cruelty within? 40th. Samuel Amador. One night in August 2004 in South San Bernardino, screams echoed from a small home. When police arrived, Michael Wilson and Pedro Rios were already dead. The scene bore clear signs of extreme violence. The killer was Samuel Amador, a man with a criminal past, driven this time by revenge and money. He used both knife and gun, leaving no one a chance to survive. Investigators quickly traced him through an accomplice who detailed every step Amador had taken. But his record was even darker. More than 20 years earlier, Amador had been linked to the brutal Ryan family attack, which left an 8-year-old child gravely wounded. In 2022, the court sentenced him to death. At San Quentin, Samuel Amador says nothing more. For in the darkness of his cell, he knows. His ending was written long ago. 41st, Michael Thomas Gargiulo, Los Angeles, on the night of February 21, 2001. In Hollywood Hills, the after-Grammy parties were about to light up. But inside the home of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin, darkness had already slipped in. A neighbor who had been seen briefly in the yard, Michael Gargiulo, had been watching her routines for weeks. When Ashley was alone and the door closed, prosecutors alleged he quietly made his way inside. 4 years later, in El Monte, 32-year-old Maria Bruno had just moved into her new apartment. An open window allowed the night to follow a chillingly similar script. In 2008 in Santa Monica, Michelle Murphy fought back and survived. But the attacker's blood remained, becoming the key thread that linked the 3 incidents. On June 6, 2008, Gargiulo was arrested. Biological evidence, travel patterns, and witness testimony formed a complete picture. In 2019, he was convicted of killing Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno, and of the attempted killing of Michelle Murphy. 2 years later, he was sentenced to death. He remains on death row, while one question still lingers over the city. Among the crowded streets we walk every day, how many strangers carry the same darkness? 42nd, Wesley Shermantine. Linden, in San Joaquin County, between the cornfields and dusty trails. From 1984 to 1998, names disappeared as if carried away by the wind. Howard King, Paul Kavanaugh, Chevelle Chevy Wheeler, Cindy Vanderheiden. In a place that seemed peaceful, Wesley Shermantine and his friend Lauren Herzog slowly emerged as shadows at the edge of the map, later dubbed by the press as the Speed Freak Killers. According to investigators, they would approach on the outskirts of town, lure victims into a vehicle, and take them to a place where the map simply ended. At first, there were only rumors, abandoned belongings, and faint marks in the dirt. It was not until 2001 that Shermantine was convicted in 4 cases and sentenced to death. 11 years later, from death row, he unexpectedly sent out hand-drawn maps to abandoned wells and dry, barren lots. Police followed them, uncovering human remains that DNA confirmed included Wheeler and Vanderheiden. The well in Linden held the remains of Kimberly Billy and Joanne Hobson, 2 other victims not included in the original convictions. The man who once buried his secrets had become a guide, leaving behind an unanswered question. Without those late maps, how many families would still be living with that unfillable space in their memories? 43rd. Skylar Preciosa de Leon, Newport Beach, on November 15, 2004. Tom and Jackie Hawks, both in their 60s, were ready to sell their yacht, the Well-Deserved, to move closer to their young grandchild. Skylar de Leon appeared friendly, offering to take a test run with his wife to build trust. But once the calm ocean surrounded the boat, prosecutors said the real plan unfolded. The couple was lured offshore. The attackers took control and seized the vessel. Paperwork was processed to look like a regular sale. Clues began to close in. Harbor security footage, the testimony of accomplice Alonzo Machine, signatures on contracts, and large withdrawals from the Hawks' accounts after they disappeared. Detectives traced the events back, linking the case to the death of John Jarvie in 2003, revealing a financial motive. In April 2009, De Leon was sentenced to death. The most haunting twist was not at sea that night, but in the way the role of friendly buyer was played to perfection, at the exact moment when the couple wanted to close one chapter of their lives. 44th, Richard Delmer Boyer, Fullerton, on December 7, 1982. In a quiet home, retired couple Francis and Eileen Harbitz were found deceased. There were no signs of a major struggle, only the cold reality of a robbery combined with a sharp force attack. Richard Boyer was arrested, and in 1984 the court sentenced him to death. In 1989, the California Supreme Court overturned the conviction for a Miranda rights violation, forcing a retrial. By 1992, Boyer was convicted again and this time did not escape the sentence. The trial became notable when the defense played the film Halloween 2, arguing that Boyer had a drug-induced flashback triggered by the movie, leading to a loss of control. The media called it the Halloween 2 defense. The jury was not convinced, and in 2006, the death sentence was upheld. It was one of the rare times a commercial film entered the courtroom, only to prove that there are boundaries no excuse can cross. 45th, Daniel Patrick Wozniak, Costa Mesa and Los Alamitos. In May 2010, Sam Hare, a veteran of Afghanistan, and Julie Kibuishi vanished in a series of unanswered messages. Everything pointed to Daniel Wozniak, a community theater actor engaged to be married, still rehearsing for a musical. According to prosecutors, for Hare's $62,000 savings, Wozniak staged the scene to shift suspicion, then performed on stage that same night as if nothing had happened. When he asked a 17-year-old to withdraw cash from Hare's account, the plan unraveled. Arrested at his bachelor party, Wozniak confessed and led police to the remains. In 2016, he was sentenced to death. His fiancée, Rachel Buffett, was later convicted of aiding in the cover-up. By day, he rehearsed scripts. By night, he wrote his own, turning real life into a stage, but ending the performance in the most irreversible way. 46th, John Scott Dunkel. In the southern San Francisco Bay Area, from 1981 to 1985, 3 teenage boys, John Thomas Davies, Lance Turner, and Sean Danahoe, vanished or were found deceased near parks, lake shores, and trails that once seemed safe. The pattern emerged, choosing a lone teenager, attacking swiftly, and leaving few traces. Investigative pressure forced multiple counties to piece together timelines, locations, and behaviors. In 1985, Dunkel was arrested. 3 cases were linked in court records. He received the death sentence for 2 of them and life without parole for the other. In 2005, the sentence was upheld. But the impact went beyond the verdict. It left behind the fragile truth of everyday life. A weekend afternoon, a familiar trail, and an absence no one ever expected. 47th, David Allen Westerfield. San Diego, the night of February 1st to 2nd, 2002. In her Sabre Springs home, 7-year-old Danielle Van Dam disappeared. By morning, neighbors flooded the streets, calling her name through the neighborhood. Investigators focused on the neighbor, David Westerfield. Gas station receipts, movements in his RV, microscopic fibers, and trace evidence from his laundry formed a compelling case. On February 22nd, he was arrested. 5 days later, Danielle's body was found. Forensic evidence became the cornerstone of the prosecution. In August, Westerfield was convicted. In January 2003, he was sentenced to death. In February 2019, the California Supreme Court upheld the sentence. He remains on death row. The lasting fear is this: the thin line between safety and danger next door, a door left slightly open, a familiar routine, and a neighbor who seemed harmless. 48th, Gunnar J. Lindbergh. Tustin, the night of January 28, 1996. On an empty school courtyard, 24-year-old Thien Min Lee was rollerblading through the cold suburban air. The calm was shattered. A lone target, an unexpected approach, and a knife flashing in the dark. Court records cited robbery and racial hatred as motives. Police worked backward from the scene. Witness statements, movements, physical evidence, and a chain of details before and after the incident. In December 1997, the jury recommended death. The court sentenced him immediately. On August 29, 2008, the California Supreme Court upheld the ruling, noting the hate crime element. Lindbergh remains on death row. The case leaves a chilling reminder. When a single glance is guided by prejudice, violence can erupt faster than any explanation can follow. 49th, Michael Anthony Jackson. West Covina, late August 1983. Officer Kenneth Reid, 26, stopped to question a suspicious man on the sidewalk. Within seconds, chaos broke out: a struggle, a shotgun taken from the patrol car, and a fatal shot that ended the young officer's watch. Jackson told investigators he had used PCP earlier that day, a detail noted in court records. In 1984, he was convicted of killing a peace officer in the line of duty and sentenced to death. In 1989, the ruling was upheld. In 2000, a federal court overturned the penalty phase. In July 2002, a new jury again recommended the death penalty. Jackson remains on California's death row. The case stands as a reminder of how fragile public order can be. One routine stop, and in an instant, everything spirals beyond control. 50th, Glenn Taylor Helzer. Summer 2000 in the Bay Area. A group calling themselves the Children of Thunder, led by Glenn Taylor Helzer, claimed to act on revelations and needed money to save the world. On July 30th, Ivan and Annette Steineman were kidnapped for ransom. On August 2nd, Selena Bishop, lured into opening bank accounts, was killed to silence her. The next morning, the violence spread to Jennifer Villerin, James Gamble, and Villerin's mother's boyfriend. Duffel bags floating in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta set the investigation in motion. Weapons, vehicles, bank transactions, and the testimony of Don Godman closed the loop. In December 2004, the jury recommended death. In March 2005, the court imposed the sentence. In January 2024, the California Supreme Court upheld it. Helzer remains on death row. The cult image concealed an opportunist willing to sacrifice anyone for money and delusion. His brother Justin later took his own life in prison. 51st, Michael Angelo Morales. Lodi, January 8, 1981. 17-year-old Terry Lynn Winchell left home and never returned. Investigators named Michael Angelo Morales and Rick Ortega. Court records describe luring, an ambush, and an assault with sexual motives. Crime scene evidence and witness testimony formed the chain of events. In 1983, Morales was convicted and sentenced to death. Over 2 decades later, on February 21, 2006, just before the execution, disputes over lethal injection procedures requiring medical supervision halted the process. The legal review has stretched on ever since. Morales remains on death row. The case reminds us that while the legal truth can be decided quickly, the method of carrying out a sentence can pull society into an endless debate. 52nd, Joseph Michael Nissensohn. On the Monterey coast, summer 1981, Tammy Lynn Jarsky, 13, and Tanya Jones, 14, went missing. By September, their remains were found in the woods. In 1989, in South Lake Tahoe, 15-year-old Kathy Graves also disappeared and was later found deceased. The man tied to all 3 cases was Joseph Michael Nissensohn. According to prosecutors, he targeted vulnerable teenage girls, restrained them, and took away their freedom. The accounts of a friend and his former wife became key. Over 3 decades, scattered clues were finally assembled into a complete file. In 2013, he was sentenced to death for all 3 cases. 2 crucial witnesses died before trial, forcing the court to use their earlier testimony. Legally permissible, but controversial. Nissensohn remains on death row. The lingering question: when the victim's voice is gone, how far can justice truly reach? 53rd, Stephen Dean Gordon, Santa Ana and Anaheim, from 2013 to 2014. Kiana Jackson, Josephine Vargas, and Martha Anaya disappeared. In March 2014, the remains of Jare Nicole Estep were discovered on a recycling conveyor belt. Investigators said the pattern was clear. Victims were lured into a vehicle, taken to secluded locations, and strangled before being discarded. The golden piece of evidence, according to court records, came from the GPS ankle monitors worn by Gordon and his accomplice, Frank Cano. The data matched the victims' last known locations. In 2017, Gordon was sentenced to death. Cano received life without parole. In a rare twist, the monitoring technology meant for supervision became the silent witness that sealed the conviction. 54th, Pedro Espinoza, Los Angeles, March 2, 2008. On a sidewalk in Arlington Heights, 17-year-old Jamiel Shaw II was walking home when a man approached. A gang challenge question, "Where are you from?" was followed by 2 gunshots that ended the young man's future. Prosecutors identified the shooter as Pedro Espinoza. Prosecutors alleged that a red Spider-Man backpack Shaw carried led Espinoza to believe he was aligned with a rival gang. Witness statements, Shaw's last phone call to his girlfriend, and gang-related context supported the case. In 2012, Espinoza was sentenced to death. The case ignited statewide debate over sanctuary city policy and the proposed Jamiel's Law. But the name to remember first is Jamiel, a young basketball player walking past a familiar street corner. 55th, David Allen Lucas, San Diego, from 1979 to 1984. Suzanne and Colin Jacobs, followed by Anne Swanka, names tied to a string of killings that left the city on edge. In late 1984, an assault survivor identified David Allen Lucas. According to investigators, boot prints, hair, fibers, and a handwritten note formed the trail of evidence. Early in the case, police had focused on another suspect before forensic work and testimony revealed the real picture. In 1989, Lucas was sentenced to death. In 2014, the California Supreme Court upheld the ruling. Sometimes just a small detail, from the sole of a shoe to the curve of handwriting, can turn suspicion in the right direction. 56th, William Lester Suff, Riverside County from 1989 to 1991. Women working in street-level sex work began to disappear, later found along roadside lots. Most showed signs consistent with strangulation, with some evidence of additional violence. While task force members worked tirelessly, William Lester Suff continued at his job in the county's warehouse, even delivering supplies to the investigators. DNA, fibers, tire tracks, shoe prints, and items found in his van matched the crime scenes. The conviction listed 12 victims. In 1995, Suff was sentenced to death. In 2014, the California Supreme Court upheld the sentence. His past revealed an earlier conviction in Texas for the death of his own child, followed by early release before arriving in California. It raised the unsettling question: how thin is the line between reintegration and repeat violence? 57th, Cleophas Prince Jr., San Diego, January to September 1990. 6 women: Tiffany Schultz, Janine Weinhold, Holly Tarr, Alyssa Keller, Pamela Clark, and Amber Clark fell victim to the man the press called the Claremont Killer. By day, he followed them from gyms, entered their homes when they were alone, often while they were showering, used a knife, and left with small personal items. Evidence accumulated: DNA at the scenes, Holly Tarr's opal ring seen on the defendant's girlfriend, shoe prints, and self-incriminating remarks. In 1993, Prince was sentenced to death. In 2007, the California Supreme Court upheld it. The case left a chilling lesson: the illusion of safety born from routine and how an offender can exploit that very illusion. 58th, Michael Hubert Hughes. In South Los Angeles, from 1986 to 1993, women were attacked, strangled, and left in public places. Hughes was already serving life without parole for 4 previous murders. In 2011, a jury convicted him in 3 additional cases: Yvonne Coleman, 15, Verna Williams, 36, and Deborah Jackson. DNA and behavioral patterns tied the cases together. In 2012, Hughes received the death penalty. In a city this large, sometimes just a trace of biological evidence is enough to unlock a maze of cases spanning years. 59th, Richard Wade Farley. Sunnyvale, February 16, 1988. After years of fixation and harassment toward co-worker Laura Black, Richard Wade Farley drove to the ESL offices. Within minutes, 7 people were dead and 4 others wounded. Laura survived. Hundreds of letters and notes to Black, receipts for weapons and ammunition, and recordings of negotiation at the scene left no doubt about intent. In 1992, Farley was sentenced to death. In 2009, the California Supreme Court upheld it. In March 2025, a request to commute to life was denied. This tragedy became a catalyst for California's anti-stalking laws and restraining order policies. The warning signs had been flashing for years. 60th, Evan Jerome Hill, Los Angeles County from 1993 to 1994. The bodies of women appeared along Highway 60, leading the media to call the killer the 60 Freeway Slayer. Most victims showed signs consistent with strangulation and were left in remote spots. The breakthrough came when Hill's DNA, collected during a 1994 incarceration, matched profiles in multiple unsolved cases. Records also linked him to taunting calls made to police. In 2007, Hill was sentenced to death for 6 murders. In 2009, he was convicted in 2 additional cases. Genetic forensics became the guiding thread through a maze of serial cases in South LA. Yet one question remains: how many unnamed victims still await recognition? 61st, Cherie Lash Rhodes, Alturas, February 20th, 2014. Inside the Cedarville Rancheria office, a meeting on expelling tribal members was underway when Cherie Lash Rhodes walked in. The sound of a semi-automatic weapon filled the room, and when the ammunition was gone, she pulled a cleaver. 4 people lost their lives, including Tribal Chairman Rurik Davis, Administrator Sheila Lynn Russo, her niece Angel Penn, and nephew Glenn Colonico, while 2 others were injured. The evidence was nearly immediate: witnesses, video recordings, and the context of an internal dispute. In 2017, Lash Rhodes was sentenced to death. It was the first death sentence in Modoc County and one of the rare cases involving a female offender. An administrative space turned into a scene of tragedy. When the meeting room door closed, the storm was already at hand. 62nd, Robert Mark Edwards, Orange County and Maui, 1986 and 1993. 2 real estate agents working alone never returned: Marjorie Elaine Diebel in California and Muriel E. Delbeck in Hawaii. Both were killed in private settings, showing signs consistent with strangulation and sexual assault. The Hawaii case, supported by DNA and physical evidence, pointed to Robert Mark Edwards. When California investigators reopened their file, scene details and professional connections began to align. Edwards received 5 life sentences in Hawaii and a death sentence in California in 1998. In 2013, the California Supreme Court upheld it. The island case shone a light back onto a cold case on the mainland. 2 crime scenes, 1 story. 63rd, Charles Ray Chase Merritt, Southern California, 2010 to 2013. Joseph and Summer McStay and their 2 young sons vanished from their home, leaving behind an unfinished meal. For years, many believed they had left the United States voluntarily. In 2013, 2 shallow graves in the Victorville Desert returned the remains of all 4, along with evidence of blunt force injuries. Attention turned to Charles Chase Merritt, Joseph's business associate. Forged checks from the company account, cell phone data, and a sledgehammer found in the grave became central evidence. In 2020, Merritt was sentenced to death. What began as a mysterious disappearance was revealed to be the killing of an entire family for financial gain, with years of silence feeding false theories. 64th, Raymond Lee Euler, Riverside County, October 2006. The Esperanza fire swept through the San Gorgonio Pass, claiming the lives of 5 firefighters. A series of fires that year carried a distinct signature: timing devices made from cigarettes, matches, and kindling materials. Raymond Lee Euler, known for photographing wildfires, became a suspect. Physical evidence, his whereabouts, and witness accounts aligned with the ignition points. In 2009, Euler was sentenced to death. In 2025, the California Supreme Court upheld the ruling. The case reinforced an important precedent. Arson that causes death is prosecuted as homicide, a crucial standard in the era of modern wildfire threats. 65th, Dean Philip Carter, Southern California, April 1984. In less than a month, 4 women were killed: Gillette Mills, Susan Knoll, Bonnie Ann Guthrie, and Jeanette Ann Collins. Mills and Knoll were found hidden in a closet, and personal items had been taken. Carter was arrested driving one victim's car, with property traced back to the victims' residences and ATM withdrawals made after the killings. Between 1989 and 1990, Carter was sentenced to death in 3 Los Angeles cases. San Diego later added a death sentence for Collins. The California Supreme Court upheld the rulings in 2005. Early in the investigation, police mistakenly arrested a friend of one victim, sending the case temporarily off course. a near miss that could have left the real killer free. 66th, David Allen Rayleigh, Hillsborough, February 2nd, 1985. The vast Carolans mansion stood quiet. 16-year-old Jeanine Grinsell and 17-year-old Lori McKenna stopped by out of curiosity and met David Allen Rayleigh, who claimed he could give them a tour. He led them into a closed-off area, restrained them, assaulted them, then forced them into a storage room and stabbed them. Rayleigh placed both girls in the trunk of his car and left them in a ravine on a cold night. Lori survived. Jeanine died from blood loss and exposure. The survivor's testimony, evidence inside the mansion, and traces from Rayleigh's car formed the basis for kidnapping and murder charges. In 1988, Rayleigh was sentenced to death. In 1992, the California Supreme Court upheld the sentence. One of his remarks still chills investigators, asking the victim to scream in the room to test the soundproofing. 67th, Regis Dion Thomas Compton, February 22, 1993. During a vehicle stop, officers Kevin Michael Burrow, 29, and James Wayne McDonald, 23, were overpowered, shot at close range, and then shot again in the head. Witness accounts, post-crime boasting, and evidence of how the firearm was handled placed Regis Dion Thomas in the case file. Arrested in April 1993, Thomas was sentenced to death in 1995. In 2012, the California Supreme Court upheld the sentence. McDonald died on what was to be his final shift as a reserve officer, a detail that left all of Compton in stunned silence. 68th, Darnell Keith Washington, California, August to October 2012. After escaping from jail, Darnell Keith Washington shot Deputy John Marquez in South El Monte. The deputy survived. A month later, in Hercules, retired teacher Susie Coe was killed in her home, and her Subaru was taken. Washington was arrested in the Seattle-Tacoma area with the victim's vehicle. DNA linked him to the weapon. His wife pleaded guilty and testified about their flight across state lines. In 2016, Washington was sentenced to death. From jailbreak to homicide, a quiet home became a crime scene, and a chain of prior warnings had already been overlooked. 69th, Jarvis J. Masters, San Quentin, June 8, 1985. In the high-security unit, Sergeant Howell Dean Birchfield was fatally stabbed with a homemade spear. Jarvis J. Masters did not wield the weapon but was accused of crafting it and conspiring in the attack. Handwritten notes, inmate testimony, and evidence of weapon preparation became the basis for conviction. In 1990, Masters was sentenced to death. Appeals over the decades have been denied, the most recent in September 2024. Outside prison, supporters claim possible wrongful conviction. Inside, the legal judgment stands. It remains one of the rare cases where public opinion and court conclusions remain far apart. 70th, Ricky Lee Fowler, San Bernardino, October 25, 2003. The old fire ignited at the base of the San Bernardino Mountains. Strong Santa Ana winds drove flames across 91,000 acres, destroying over 1,000 homes. Amid evacuation chaos, 5 people died from heart-related complications linked to the disaster. Prosecutors named Ricky Lee Fowler, accused of throwing an incendiary object from a car into dry brush out of personal spite, sparking one of the most destructive wildfires in state history. Witness statements, travel routes, and testimony supported intent. In 2013, Fowler was sentenced to death for 5 counts of murder and arson. One small spark turned an entire mountainside into a crime scene, raising the question, who bears responsibility when the consequences spread beyond imagination? We have now gone through 30 chilling case files. And let us be absolutely clear, these are crimes, never stories to glorify. Uncarried death sentences do not erase the real loss. A dinner table with an empty chair, a bedroom light that will never turn on again, letters that will never be answered. The victims and their families are not just names in a file. They are dreams, birthdays left unfinished, and futures cut short. If there is one takeaway, let it be this: stand with the victims. Stay vigilant without living in fear, speak for those without a voice, and reject any form of normalizing violence. Which case resonated most with you? Leave a message of support for the victims' families in the comments. Thank you for listening with your heart. We'll see you in the next episode of Crimes Unearthed 911, where we tell these stories so they are not forgotten and so they are never repeated.